Hello, welcome to Cognitive Psychology, and I'm going to begin the course by talking about the very first psychology experiment, and we'll talk about what that means in terms of this class and the type of material that we will be talking about. So, the very first psychology experiment was actually conducted in 7th century BC, and it was actually recorded for history's sake by a Greek historian. But the Egyptians, big, powerful people, and like all big, powerful people, they tend to have thought of themselves as pretty special, and they believed that they were the very first people on this earth. Right? And the king at the time decided that he wanted to prove that. And then the question becomes, how do you prove that? Well, it occurred to him that if the Egyptian were the original nation in the world, very first people to be on this planet, then the most basic, most primal language had to be Egyptian. Okay? So he set up the first experiment, and the research question then is, what is the primal language? Right? And he decided he would do this by isolating children from adult speech. And what he did was he took two children born from a lower class mother from birth, and he took them to live with a shepherd out in the country. And the shepherd was told not to ever talk to the children, that he could bring them food, care for them, treat them well, but never ever speak to them, and make sure that they never heard any adult speech. Of course, this meant that they could hear all the shepherd's flock out there going ba ba, which put some risk at the children's first words being ba instead of some actual language, as the king of Egypt was hoping. Right? But the measure for this experiment was the first word spoken. Okay? And the king expected, because Egypt was the first nation in the world, they were the original people, right? That first word would be Egyptian. Right? So that's his alternative hypothesis. The first word these children will speak when raised in isolation from human speech, from adult speech, would be Egyptian. The null, of course, is that it would not be Egyptian. Right? So, the king finds two children, gives them to the shepherd. The shepherd takes good care of them, but never ever speaks to them. They get to hear the sheep and the goats and whatever else the shepherd had out there, chickens, whatever, but never any human speech. And everything's going fine. And one day, the children come running towards the shepherd, and they're yelling, they're speaking some word. And the word was Bekos. All right, and shepherd had no idea what the word was, but he reports it to the king. The king gets all his counselors and wise men and scholars together, and they've never heard Bekos, and so they search every resource they have, and eventually realize it's not Egyptian, but Pharyngian. Another people that lived in that area. Yeah. I'm sure we all remember our ancient history in the Pharyngians, right? But it's a Pharyngian word for bread. So, king has this great experiment, and he, in the end, fails to reject the null. Egyptian is not the primal language. The Egyptians themselves were not the first people, right? And based on the evidence, we would have to call it, we would suggest that it's the Pharyngians instead. Well, it's an interesting experiment, and it's got several importance to us in this class. One is just showing that there's always been a history in in behavior, in the mind, and trying to understand how things work. And there's this history of also recognizing that whatever we do, right, there's this underlying complexity to it. While it may be simple to say a simple word like bread, right, there's many influences in terms of what language we speak when we say that word. And context matters, right? So, in a Christian context, talking about bread, the bread of life, right? Not talking about the bread that you eat, but in a kitchen, in a meal context, if I talk about bread, then that matters. If I talk about breaking bread, it could have the religious connotation, or it's just bringing family or friends together and sharing that experience. So there's a complexity in this, and context matters in terms of understanding the words that we're hearing or the processes that we're doing, and behavior is certainly influenced by many, many different contexts. Right? And in this case, the king certainly understands the importance of environment. And the experiment itself raises what's really probably the question that we will explore the most as we go through this class, is what's innate and what's learned from experience. And though this experiment doesn't necessarily raise it, there's a bigger question of how do innate processes influence our experience? How does that shape cognition in itself? For the king, he as I said, understood the influence of environment. Right? But what he is arguing is that language itself was innate. Okay? The environment might shape what language you spoke, but you remove the environment and language would still appear intact. Okay? We certainly wouldn't recognize that today, but we still ask similar arguments. Okay? And these are arguments that people have been debating certainly since the time of ancient Egypt, or ancient Greece, certainly since ancient Egypt, but certainly since ancient Greece, which is when philosophy really began to develop into formal schools. Okay? And one of the big questions becomes, are processes a priori or a posteriori? Now, a priori means before, and a posterior means after. Yeah, so, or prior, posterior. And the argument here is, are things innate? Are they native? Right? Are they hardwired into our brain? Are they genetic? What is there pre-existing? What are we born with? Versus what do we gain from experience? We will explore this as we go along. But again, if you look in terms of that first experiment, the king is arguing that language itself is a priori. It's there. Okay? But experience shapes the language that we speak. Okay? Today we wouldn't say that we're born with any language, right? But we are, a priori, born with the ability to recognize language, to recognize the components of language. But a posteriori, through experience, we learn the language that our parents speak, to the exclusion of being able to hear and understand the other languages. But, on top of that, it's not just understanding the meaning of words, and we'll talk about this when we get to the language module, but it's not just about understanding the meaning of words. Underlying language is a certain order, certain laws or rules we call grammar. So we can't put words just in any order. Order any words. Right? For us to understand things, we don't have to just understand the meaning of the words, but they have to appear in a certain order. And so when we start talking about a priori versus a posteriori language, it's not just about the language itself, it's the grammar underneath it. Are there certain inborn native rules that govern how words go together, how they're structured to make that the grammar component of language. And much of what we will talk about as we get to attention and memory, these are processes that have limits on them. In fact, much of cognition is limited in certain ways for reasons, right? And those limits then influence our experience. They influence how we remember. They influence what we attend to, what we don't attend to. The more focused we get, the harder it is to see what's in front of us. There's all sorts of implications due to these, what kind of the innate parts of our experiences and the actual experiences themselves. So the question of whether things are a priori or a posteriori, it turns out to be a very difficult question to ask. And like I said, people have been debating this forever, and they will continue to debate it. And a large part of it was when we're studying cognition, what we have to remember is we're studying processes we cannot see. No one's ever seen a thought. No one's ever seen a memory. All right? We infer these things from behavior. Okay? I'll give you a list to remember. I ask you to recall as many words in that list as you can, and from that I infer memory. All right? Your memory of that list. I give you a problem to solve. You come up with an answer. I never see the problem solving. Even if I was to stick you in a functional MRI and get all kinds of fancy colored pictures of your brain as you're processing that, never, ever do I see the actual problem solving. I never see the thinking that goes into it. I never see the decision making that's there, the reasoning, anything that's involved in that problem solving. We can't see. All those fancy color pictures that come out of functional MRIs, PET scans, all those sorts of things are just showing areas of activity in the brain. They don't show what's actually happening there. So we never see a thought. And because we're studying processes we can't see, it makes it hard, right, to actually completely answer questions, right? Such as, are things native or learned? And what it also means is a certain ingenuity in trying to study all these things. And we will look at that as this class moves on. So again, welcome to Cognitive Psych, and I wish you, hope you enjoy this class, and I wish you well as you go through it.